At 7 months pregnant, my husband asked for a divorce, claiming you and that baby will only hold me back. 18 years later, he came back demanding to meet his son, but he had no idea who my son really was. At 17 years old and 7 months pregnant, my husband asked for a divorce, claiming that the baby and I would only slow him down. 18 years later, he tracked me down at a local restaurant, throwing a $5,000 check in my face to buy his way out of a $15 million secret. He had no idea who my son really was, or that the woman he was trying to intimidate practically owned the ground he walked on. My name is Elise. Today, I'm 35 years old. I run one of the most ruthless crisis PR firms in Silicon Valley. But to the man standing in front of me, I was still just the pathetic teenage girl he threw away. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed his entire existence, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you've ever had to build your own empire after someone told you you'd never amount to anything. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when the past decided to kick down my door. I was sitting in my favorite corner of a rundown local diner just outside San Francisco. It was the kind of place with sticky vinyl booths, flickering neon signs, and coffee that tasted like it had been burning on the hot plate since yesterday. I loved that place. After spending all week managing the manufactured crises of tech billionaires, dealing with venture capital meltdowns, and suffocating in designer suits, this diner was my sanctuary. I was wearing faded gray cotton sweatpants, my hair tied up in a messy bun, completely makeup-free. I was quietly enjoying a plate of eggs while reading the morning financial news on my phone. Then the little brass bell above the diner door rang sharply. I didn't look up right away. I was too busy reviewing a press release for an important client. But then heavy, arrogant footsteps approached my table and stopped. The scent of overpowering, incredibly expensive cologne cut through the smell of fried bacon and cheap coffee. Slowly, I lifted my eyes from my screen. Standing there, looking like he had just stepped out of a luxury magazine, was Bradley. He looked exactly as I remembered him, just an older, more polished version of the selfish boy who had shattered my world 18 years earlier. He wore a tailored navy Italian suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. His hair was perfectly slicked back, and his posture screamed arrogance. He looked around the gloomy diner with obvious disgust, literally wrinkling his nose at the cracked linoleum floors and the exhausted waitress wiping down the counter. Then he looked at me. His eyes swept over my baggy gray sweatpants, my plain shirt, and my makeup-free face. I saw a familiar, disgusting smile spread across his lips. It was the look of a man who believed his worst assumptions had just been confirmed. "Well, well, well," Bradley said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I can't say I'm surprised, Elise. I always knew this is exactly where you'd end up." I stayed perfectly still. I didn't gasp, cry, or even blink. The terrified, heartbroken 17-year-old girl who had once begged him on her knees to stay was long dead. She died the day he packed his bags for an Ivy League college and left me alone with a swollen belly and an eviction notice. In her place stood a woman who navigated shark-infested corporate waters for a living. I simply locked my phone screen, placed it face down on the sticky table, and picked up my coffee cup. "What do you want, Bradley?" I asked, my tone flat and completely emotionless. He laughed a harsh, mocking sound. "No hello? No, how have you been? I guess poverty really ruins a person's manners. I had to hire a private investigator just to find you. You don't leave much of a digital footprint, do you? I suppose that's because you can't afford decent internet, much less a life worth posting about." He slid into the booth across from me, grimacing as the old vinyl creaked under his weight. He didn't wait to be invited. Reaching into his tailored jacket, he pulled out a sleek leather checkbook and removed a piece of paper. With a dramatic flick of his wrist, He tossed it onto the table. It landed right beside my half-eaten plate of eggs. I looked down. It was a cashier's check made out to me for exactly $5,000. I looked back up at him, raising an eyebrow. "What is this?" I asked. "Consider it an act of charity," Bradley said, leaning back and crossing his arms. "I'm doing very well, Elise. I'm an investment director at one of the city's top venture capital firms. I drive a car worth more than you'll make in a decade. My wife is beautiful, sophisticated, and we move in the same elite circles. I have everything. And looking at you, sitting in this greasy diner in those pathetic sweatpants, it's obvious you're still struggling just to survive." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter liquid coat my tongue. And I let him keep talking. "In my line of work, you learn that arrogant men always reveal their weaknesses when they think they're winning. I know you probably still hold some ridiculous grudge because I left for college," he continued, his voice taking on a sickeningly fake tone of sympathy. "But let's be realistic. If I had stayed with you and that baby, I'd be miserable and broke. I made the smart decision. I chose success. But I'm not a monster. Our son just turned 18, right? I figured you could use a little help. Buy yourself some decent clothes. Maybe move out of whatever terrible neighborhood you're renting in. $5,000 is probably more money than you've ever seen in your life." He tapped the table with his perfectly manicured finger right next to the check. "Take it, Elise. Take the money and consider it late child support. Consider it my way of officially clearing my conscience. I'm giving you a gift." I looked at the check again. $5,000. To the teenage girl he abandoned, that money would have meant salvation. It would have meant buying a crib, paying hospital bills, keeping the electricity on during those freezing winter nights when I had to wrap my newborn son in 3 blankets just to keep him warm. But to the woman sitting across from him now, it was nothing more than an insult. I didn't touch the paper. I simply looked at the man who had caused me so much pain, feeling absolutely nothing except clinical curiosity. He was hiding something. A man like Bradley, a narcissist who had ignored his own flesh and blood for 18 years, doesn't hire a private investigator and track down his ex-wife just to clear his conscience. There was an ulterior motive. He wanted something, and he thought $5,000 was enough to buy my submission. "Did you really come all the way here just to give me a check?" I asked softly, letting a hint of vulnerability slip into my voice just to see how he would react. Bradley smiled, convinced he had me exactly where he wanted me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and closing the distance between us. "Well, there's a little paperwork that comes with it," he said casually, as if it were some minor detail. "Just a formality, really. Nothing you need to worry your pretty little head about." "Interesting." I placed my index finger on the edge of the crisp paper. Slowly and deliberately, I slid the cashier's check back across the sticky table until it rested against his coffee cup. My hand didn't tremble. My breathing remained perfectly steady. "Keep your charity, Bradley," I said. My voice was a low, steady hum that cut through the diner's background noise. "I don't want your money." His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, harder and more aggressive than before. He let out a sharp, condescending laugh and shook his head. "Don't play this pride game with me, Elise. We both know you're desperate. You're sitting here in cheap sweatpants, looking exactly like the hopeless tragedy I always knew you'd become. You're a single mother, probably working 3 minimum wage jobs just to keep the lights on. $5,000 is a fortune to you. Take the money and sign the paper. It's a simple transaction. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." A transaction. The word hung in the air between us. I looked into his eyes, searching for any trace of a human being, any hint of remorse for the wreckage he had left behind nearly 2 decades earlier. There was nothing. Only the cold, calculating stare of a man who viewed people as either stepping stones or obstacles. A formality, I repeated his earlier words. Just like our divorce was a formality. Do you remember the day you handed me those papers, Bradley? Do you remember the exact words you used? He rolled his eyes, groaning with exaggerated frustration. Adjusting his silk tie as though the mere mention of our past was an inconvenience to his otherwise perfect day, he sighed. Oh, please. Are we really doing this? Digging up ancient history? We were kids, Elise. We made a mistake. I fixed it. Get over it. I was 17 years old, I said, my voice dropping an octave, heavy with dangerous weight. I was 17 and 7 months pregnant with your child. My feet were swollen. I was exhausted. I was working double shifts at a rundown grocery store just so I could afford my prenatal vitamins, because you spent every cent we had on designer clothes for your college admission interviews. I leaned forward, placing my arms on the table, refusing to let him look away. You stood in the doorway of our miserable little studio apartment holding your acceptance letter. You looked at my stomach, looked at the child we created, and said the words that define the rest of my life. Bradley stared back at me. His jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. You said you and that baby will only hold me back. I recited the memory sharply and vividly, not out of pain, but out of absolute clarity. You said, I have to go to Harvard. I don't have time to play family with a useless loser. Then you dropped the divorce papers on the kitchen counter, picked up your suitcase, and walked out the door. You left me with our empty bank account and an eviction notice taped to the door. For a moment, the diner around us seemed to fade away. The clinking of silverware and the chatter of the other customers faded into a graveyard silence. I expected him to look away. I expected at least a flicker of shame to cross his perfectly groomed face. Most men, when confronted with the ugliest version of themselves, would show some sign of regret. But Bradley was not like most men. Instead of looking away, he straightened up, smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit, and met my gaze with chilling arrogance. And I was right, he stated, his voice devoid of even a single ounce of guilt. I was absolutely right to leave. I stared at him, letting his monstrous confession hang in the air. Look at me, Elise, he continued, spreading his arms as if presenting his magnificent life. Look at everything I've accomplished. I went to the best university in the country. I climbed the corporate ladder faster than anyone in my class. I managed millions of dollars for top-tier venture capital firms. I live in a penthouse. I married a woman who understands my ambition. I built an empire. He leaned across the table, pointing a stern finger at me. If I had stayed in that pathetic little studio apartment with you and a screaming baby, I would have suffocated. I would have thrown my potential down the drain just to play house with a girl who had no ambition and no future. You were an anchor dragging me down. Leaving you was the smartest financial and personal decision I've ever made in my entire life. He picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, and slammed it back down onto the table. I have never regretted leaving you, he said, enunciating every word. Not for a single second. Every promotion I earned, every bonus I collected, every high society gala I attended proved that I made the right decision. I cut dead weight so I could fly. Honestly, you should thank me. Me leaving forced you to face reality. It's not my fault you failed to make something of yourself. It's not my fault you're still sitting in a place like this looking like a complete disaster. The sheer audacity of his words was astonishing. He genuinely believed his own narrative. He believed his bank account justified his cruelty. He believed wearing an expensive suit made him superior to the woman he had abandoned. He thought he was looking at a failure. He had no idea he was staring at the executioner of his entire career. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw coffee in his face. I simply smiled. It was a small, terribly cold smile that made his confident expression falter for just a fraction of a second. You're right about one thing, Bradley, I said softly. Your leaving did force me to face reality. It taught me exactly how the world works. It taught me that ruthless men like you only respect power." He scoffed and shook his head. "Don't try to sound philosophical, Elise. It doesn't suit you. We're not here to discuss my incredible success or your obvious failures. We're here to do business." He shoved the $5,000 check back toward me along with folded documents from his briefcase. He tapped the papers impatiently. "Take the money," he ordered, his tone shifting from arrogant bragging to sharp authority. "I don't have all day. I have a board meeting at noon, and my time is worth hundreds of dollars per minute. Call the boy down here right now. Have him sign the papers, and then both of you can go back to your miserable lives. I'm offering you a lifeline. I strongly suggest you don't bite the hand that feeds you." I watched his perfectly manicured hands move toward the expensive leather briefcase resting beside him on the vinyl seat. The metallic snap of the clasps rang sharply through the diner, cutting through the low hum of conversation. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal-sized papers bound together with a heavy black clip. He spread them across the sticky table with an air of enormous self-importance, completely ignoring the small puddle of spilled coffee near the edge. "My father passed away last month," Bradley announced. His tone carried absolutely no grief. There was no sadness in his eyes, no heaviness in his posture. He delivered the news of his own father's death with the same inflection someone might use to report a minor stock market fluctuation. It was cold, calculated, simply a transition into the business portion of his unexpected visit. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I had never met the man. During the brief time Bradley and I were married, his wealthy family treated me like a contagious disease, refusing to acknowledge my existence. I felt no sympathy for the loss. But I stayed silent, waiting for the real reason he had tracked me down after 18 years of complete silence. The old man got ridiculously sentimental at the end, Bradley continued, waving his hand dismissively. His mind was slipping during those last few weeks. He started obsessing over making amends and tying up loose ends. Before he died, he changed his estate plan. He decided to leave a little something for the boy, a small allowance, just to clear his conscience. He reached over and tapped the $5,000 check he had thrown at me earlier. "This," Bradley said, his voice dripping with forced generosity, "is $5,000. A pretty generous farewell gift for a kid he never even met. Don't you think? I'm the executor of the estate, so I'm personally handling these minor disbursements. All I need is a signature confirming receipt of the funds." He slid the thick stack of legal papers across the table. They stopped directly in front of me. On top of the stack was a bright yellow sticky note pointing directly to a signature line at the bottom of the page. Beside the papers, he placed a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. I didn't pick up the pen. Instead, I lowered my eyes to the documents. In my line of work, dealing with corporate sabotage and hostile takeovers, reading the fine print isn't just a habit, it's a survival skill. My eyes immediately skipped past the brightly colored sticky note and locked onto the bold, capitalized heading at the top of the first page. It did not say receipt of funds. It did not say estate disbursement acknowledgement. The bold black letters read, "Waiver of rights, release, and comprehensive inheritance forfeiture." My heart thudded once hard against my ribs, but my expression remained perfectly frozen. I quickly scanned the dense paragraphs of legal jargon beneath the title. It was a masterpiece of predatory legal drafting. The document explicitly stated that the signer permanently, irrevocably, and completely waived any and all future claims to the deceased's estate, trust funds, assets, properties, and holdings. By signing the document, the person would accept a one-time payment of $5,000 in exchange for walking away from absolutely everything else forever. It was a trap. A blatant, filthy, illegal trap wrapped in a cheap suit of charity. Since the boy turned 18 last week, he's legally an adult now, Bradley said, pulling me from my rapid internal analysis. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, and completely deceptive. I know his birthday was a few days ago. That means he can sign for himself. I don't have to deal with family courts or guardianship laws anymore. You just take these papers home, have him sign right there on the dotted line, send the packet back to my office in the prepaid envelope I provided, and the $5,000 is yours. You can cash the check today. I looked up from the fraudulent waiver document and met his gaze. He was trying to appear bored, but the slight tension in his jaw and the subtle forward lean of his shoulders betrayed him. He was anxious. He desperately needed that signature. You want him to sign away a legal inheritance for a $5,000 allowance? I asked, keeping my voice soft and deliberately naive. It's just standard legal protection for the estate, Bradley lied smoothly without missing a beat. Rich families have to protect themselves from frivolous future lawsuits. It simply confirms he received his grandfather's gift and closes the chapter on the matter. It's a win-win situation, especially for you, Elise. He leaned closer, lowering his voice into a tone of fake sympathy that made my stomach twist. Let's be brutally honest here, he murmured. I know exactly how people like you live. You're a single mother who got left behind before her life even started. You're probably drowning in overdue notices right now. I bet your landlord constantly threatens to throw you out of whatever tiny apartment you manage to rent. You probably buy discounted groceries and panic every time the check engine light comes on in whatever junk car you drive. You spend your nights crying, wondering how you're going to pay the heating bill. He gestured vaguely around the rundown diner. You're eating breakfast in a place that smells like old grease, because this is the only luxury you can afford. $5,000 is a massive amount of money for a woman in your position. Think about what this money can do for you, Elise. You could pay off your credit cards. You could finally buy the boy some decent clothes. You could actually breathe for a few months without worrying about surviving until your next minimum wage paycheck. He pushed the gold pen closer to my hand. His eyes were dark and urgent, silently commanding me to obey him, just like I used to when I was a terrified 17-year-old girl. Don't let your stupid pride ruin this opportunity, he demanded softly. The old man felt sorry for you and the boy. He threw you a bone. I'm personally delivering it to you, saving you the legal trouble of dealing with the estate lawyers. Take the money, Elise. Take the money. Go home to your son. Have him sign the paper and fix your miserable life. It's the best deal you're ever going to get. I leaned back against the creaking vinyl booth, looking at the $5,000 check, then the inheritance waiver, and finally at the man who believed he held all the power in the room. I analyzed the situation with the cold precision of a crisis PR executive managing a corporate disaster. Bradley wasn't here out of obligation. He was here out of fear. He was trying to buy his son's inheritance for a pathetic $5,000. I suddenly understood that whatever my son had inherited was monumental. Bradley was attempting to commit multi-million-dollar fraud right on top of my breakfast plate. He assumed I was an uneducated, desperate, broken woman who would blindly sign away her son's birthright for a few months of rent money. He was counting on my poverty. He was counting on my ignorance. I looked at the gold pen resting on the table. It reflected the flickering fluorescent lights of the diner. Bradley let out a soft sigh of victory. He thought he had me. He thought the weight of my supposed poverty was pressing down on my shoulders, forcing my hand. I leaned forward. My fingers brushed the heavy gold pen, then closed instead around the edges of the $5,000 cashier's check. I picked it up. The paper was thick and crisp. Bradley smiled, his eyes gleaming with greedy satisfaction. He leaned back against the vinyl booth, waiting for my submission. I maintained intense, unbroken eye contact with him as I raised my other hand. I grabbed the opposite edge of the check. Then, with one slow and deliberate motion, I tore the $5,000 check straight down the middle. The sharp ripping sound of paper sliced through the restaurant's background noise. Bradley froze. His arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of pure, stunned shock. Before he could process what was happening, I stacked the two torn halves together and ripped them again. Then I picked up the comprehensive waiver of rights. I grabbed the thick stack of legal documents, the fraudulent papers designed to steal my son's birthright, and tore them completely in half. I dropped the shredded pieces of his pathetic bribe directly into the puddle of spilled coffee on the table. The ink from the bright yellow sticky note immediately began bleeding into the dark liquid. For 5 agonizing seconds, Bradley stared at the destroyed documents. His brain couldn't process the scene unfolding in front of him. A desperate, struggling single mother wasn't supposed to destroy a $5,000 lifeline. She was supposed to cry with gratitude. She was supposed to obey. When reality finally registered, his reaction was explosive. "Are you insane?" he shouted, his voice trembling with sudden, volatile rage. He slammed his palm against the table. The violent impact rattled the silverware and splashed black coffee over the rim of my cup. "You stupid, ignorant woman. Do you have any idea what you just did? I offered you a way out of your miserable existence, and you just ripped it to pieces." I remained perfectly still, my posture relaxed and completely unfazed by his sudden aggression. His outburst was nothing compared to the boardroom tantrums I handled every day. "I'm not signing anything," I said. My voice dropped into a low, lethal whisper. "And my son won't sign anything either. You can take your fraudulent waiver and your fake charity and get away from my table." His face flushed a furious, violent red. The veins in his neck bulged against his pristine white collar. The polished venture capitalist had disappeared completely, revealing the nasty, vicious boy he had always been beneath the expensive suit. "You think you can play games with me?" he growled, leaning across the table until his face was inches from mine. "You think you can reject my generosity and walk away? You have no idea who you're dealing with, Elise. I have millions of dollars at my disposal. I have power. I have connections. You are nobody. You're a waitress or a cashier or whatever pathetic job you work just to survive. You are nothing." I didn't flinch. I let him keep digging his own grave. "If you want to do this the hard way, then we'll do it the hard way," Bradley threatened, his voice dripping with malice. "I'll hire the most ruthless legal team in the entire state of California. I'll drag you into family court. I'll file a massive lawsuit against you for parental alienation. I'll tell a judge you deliberately kept my son hidden from me for 18 years and obstructed my rights as a father. I'll bury you in so much legal debt that you'll lose whatever garbage apartment you live in. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be begging on your knees to sign that paper." He pointed a shaking finger at the destroyed check soaking in the coffee puddle. "I try to do this nicely," he sneered. "I tried to give you an elegant way out. Now you get nothing. I'm going to crush you, Elise. I'm going to make you regret the day you decided to cross me. You're going to lose everything." I looked at his accusing finger, then at his furious red face. "Are you finished?" I asked. My tone was so completely devoid of fear that it made him blink in confusion. "Because you're making a scene, and I'm trying to finish my breakfast." Bradley let out a sound of pure disgust, snatched his gold pen off the table, and shoved it back into his jacket pocket. He rose from the booth stiffly, trying to recover some of his intimidating presence. He glared down at me one last time, his eyes filled with absolute hatred. "Expect to hear from my lawyers," he promised in a rough whisper. "You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life." Then he turned sharply and stormed toward the exit. The heavy glass door slammed open and shut behind him, the little diner bell ringing wildly in his wake. I remained at the table. The waitress hurried over, staring at the torn papers and spilled coffee with wide, worried eyes. I gave her a reassuring smile, handed her a $50 bill from my pocket, told her to keep the change, and asked for a fresh cup of black coffee. I didn't shed a single tear. My hands weren't shaking. My heartbeat was completely steady. I didn't feel the crushing panic Bradley had desperately wanted to inflict on me. I only felt a cold, calculating sense of anticipation. I watched the dark coffee seep into the torn edges of the waiver document. Bradley thought he had just declared war on a helpless victim. He thought he was the predator and I was the prey. He had no idea he had just blindly stepped into a minefield. I slipped my hand into the pocket of my gray sweatpants and pulled out my smartphone. It wasn't a cheap disposable phone or some cracked outdated device. It was the latest secure flagship model, essential for managing global media crises and coordinating with my elite corporate teams. I unlocked the screen with a quick swipe. I opened my encrypted messaging app and scrolled to a specific contact. The name saved in my phone was DeAndre. DeAndre was my older sister's husband. He was also a senior partner at one of the most ruthless and prestigious corporate law firms in San Francisco. He was a brilliant shark in the courtroom, a man who dismantled fraudulent executives and hostile takeovers for sport. And he was fiercely protective of both me and my son. He possessed the legal firepower to crush a mid-level venture capital director like Bradley as easily as stepping on a small irritating insect. I tapped the message box. My thumbs flew across the digital keyboard with practiced speed and precision. I didn't need to explain the entire story or the emotional weight of the encounter. DeAndre already knew the history. He knew exactly what Bradley was capable of. I only needed to give him a directive. I typed a single short message. Review the actual Bradley family estate will immediately. Bradley just showed up trying to force Leo to sign away inheritance rights for $5,000. He just dug his own grave. I hit send. I locked my phone and set it back down on the table just as the waitress returned with a fresh steaming cup of coffee. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic mug, inhaling the rich roasted aroma slowly and deeply. Bradley wanted a war. He wanted to use his money and status to intimidate me into surrendering my son's rightful inheritance. He wanted to drag me through the mud and prove that he was the undisputed winner in the story of our lives. I took a sip of the dark coffee, allowing a genuine, satisfied smile to finally spread across my lips. The battle lines had been drawn. But the enemy was completely blind. I was going to strip away his arrogant facade. I was going to tear down the false empire he had built on top of my broken teenage heart. He thought I was a failure. He was about to discover exactly who I had become. 2 weeks later, the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and the excited chatter of hundreds of proud families. It was graduation day at one of the most competitive high schools in the Bay Area. The morning sun bathed the football field in a golden glow as teenagers in navy blue gowns tossed their caps into the sky. I stood a short distance away, holding up my phone to record the moment, my chest swelling with deep, overwhelming pride. My son Leo had just graduated at the top of his class. He was laughing with his friends, holding his diploma and looking incredibly handsome. I wore a simple tailored beige trench coat over a white silk blouse, blending perfectly into the crowd of celebrating parents. It was supposed to be a flawless, perfect morning. Then the loud, obnoxious clicking of designer heels against the concrete sidewalk shattered the peace. Well, isn't this a charming little public gathering? A sharp, screeching voice rang out over the crowd. I turned around, and my blood instantly ran cold. Pushing through a cluster of families taking photos was a woman I had never met in person, but instantly recognized from the gala pictures Bradley proudly posted online. Monica. She was 10 years younger than Bradley, dripping in designer labels, wearing oversized sunglasses, and carrying a handbag that screamed newly acquired wealth. Right behind her, walking with that same infuriatingly arrogant stride, was Bradley. And beside him stood a greasy-looking man in a cheap gray suit clutching a thick leather briefcase. Bradley didn't even have the decency to pull me aside. He marched straight toward Leo, who was standing with a group of classmates. My maternal instincts immediately flared. I moved quickly through the crowd and positioned myself directly between my ex-husband and my son. "This is a private family celebration, Bradley," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. "You are not welcome here. Turn around and leave right now." Bradley ignored me completely. He leaned sideways, trying to look over my shoulder at Leo. "There he is," Bradley announced loudly, making sure nearby families stopped taking pictures and turned to stare at the high school graduate. "You look exactly how I imagined." Leo stopped laughing with his friends, handed his diploma to a classmate, and stepped forward until he stood beside me. At 18 years old, Leo was already taller than Bradley. He had inherited my calm demeanor and brilliant analytical mind, but at that moment his eyes narrowed with sharp confusion. "Who are you?" Leo asked, his voice steady and polite but completely devoid of warmth. "I'm your father," Bradley declared, puffing out his chest and adjusting his expensive jacket. "And I'm here to do what your mother hasn't done for 18 years. I'm here to secure your future." Before Leo could even process the shock of a father he had never known suddenly appearing out of nowhere, Monica inserted herself into the confrontation. She lowered her oversized sunglasses and looked Leo up and down with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "It's an absolute tragedy that your mother kept you trapped in poverty," Monica announced loudly enough for every parent within 50 feet to hear clearly. "Look at you, wearing a cheap polyester gown at some ordinary public school. You could have had a real life if she weren't so unbelievably selfish and bitter." I stepped toward Monica, but she simply crossed her arms and sneered. "My husband is a top-level financial executive," Monica continued, her voice carrying across the silent, stunned crowd. "He manages millions of dollars for the most elite venture capital firms in the state, and you've been forced to live on whatever scraps your mother could scrape together from her pathetic little jobs. She kept you away from a life of extreme privilege just to punish my husband. She's a toxic, manipulative woman who's been holding you back from success." Parents nearby began whispering. Several people lifted their phones. Bradley and Monica were weaponizing public humiliation. They were deliberately creating a massive, humiliating scene at my son's graduation in order to break our resolve. "That's enough," I warned, my tone dropping into a lethal whisper. "You are harassing a teenager on school property. Leave before I call campus security." "Call them," Bradley laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Who do you think they're going to believe, Elise? A highly respected financial executive offering a graduation gift, or a hostile mother throwing a tantrum?" Bradley snapped his fingers. The greasy man in the gray suit stepped forward and opened his leather briefcase. He pulled out a familiar stack of legal documents and a pen. It was the same comprehensive inheritance waiver Bradley had tried to force on me at the diner. "Your mother is too proud and too stupid to accept charity," Bradley said, now directing all his attention toward Leo. "But now you're 18 years old. You are legally an adult in the eyes of the state now. Your grandfather recently passed away and left you a small graduation gift. $5,000. All you have to do is sign this basic receipt right now, and I'll hand over the cashier's check. Then you can finally buy yourself a decent used car, or maybe make a down payment on community college tuition." Monica stepped in closer to Leo, wagging a manicured finger in his face. "Just sign the paper, kid. Your mother can't give you any kind of future. We're offering you a way out of this miserable poverty." Don't let her toxic pride drag you into the dirt forever. Just take the money and be grateful. Bradley grabbed the pen from his lawyer and aggressively shoved it toward Leo's chest. I brought my legal advisor today just to make sure everything is properly handled, Bradley threatened, his voice dropping into a menacing growl. Sign it right here on the hood of my car, and we'll leave you alone to enjoy your little celebration. Make a scene, and I'll drag your mother through a brutal court battle that will leave her completely bankrupt. I'll sue her for retroactive custodial fraud and parental alienation. I'll ruin her pathetic life. Sign the waiver, or I'll destroy everything she has left. The choice is yours, son. The entire courtyard held its breath. The silence was deafening. Bradley and Monica stood there radiating arrogant triumph, fully convinced they had successfully cornered a poor, helpless single mother and her teenage son with no escape. They thought public humiliation and a handful of money would force a frightened teenager to blindly sign away his rights just to make the nightmare end. They thought they had won. The greasy lawyer cleared his throat and stepped forward to reinforce his client's malicious threats. He raised a trembling finger and opened his mouth, preparing to recite a list of fabricated legal consequences designed to terrorize a high school student. He slapped the fraudulent document against his briefcase, demanding immediate compliance. Before a single syllable of his rehearsed intimidation could leave his mouth, a large, impeccably dressed arm reached directly over my shoulder. A strong hand, adorned with a subtle yet astonishingly expensive platinum watch, intercepted the cheap plastic pen Bradley had shoved toward Leo. The movement was so smooth, so utterly devoid of hesitation, that Bradley physically stepped backward as if he had been struck. I didn't need to turn my head to know who had arrived. The cool scent of cedar and expensive espresso announced his presence first, followed by an imposing shadow that instantly dwarfed Bradley and his pathetic entourage. DeAndre. My sister's husband was a striking 38-year-old black man who commanded absolute respect the second he entered any room. He was the senior managing partner at one of the most feared corporate litigation firms in San Francisco. He spent his days dismantling corrupt executives and negotiating multi-billion-dollar hostile takeovers. He never needed to raise his voice to establish dominance. He simply existed, and the world naturally bent to his authority. Today, he wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that fit his athletic frame with lethal perfection. He looked exactly like an alpha predator who had just spotted a very weak and very foolish prey animal trying to hunt on his territory. DeAndre smoothly removed the pen from Bradley's frozen hand. He did not look at my ex-husband. He did not acknowledge Monica, who was staring at him with wide, confused eyes. His sharp dark gaze locked directly onto the greasy little man in the cheap gray suit holding the fraudulent waiver. The small lawyer swallowed audibly. The color drained rapidly from his face, turning his skin a pale, sickly shade. He clearly recognized the prestigious insignia pinned to DeAndre's lapel. He recognized the unmistakable aura of a man who could end his professional career with a single phone call. Are you the legal counsel advising this man to harass a high school student on public property? DeAndre asked. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly across the suddenly silent courtyard, capturing the attention of every nearby person. The greasy lawyer stammered nervously, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I'm simply facilitating a standard estate disbursement. We're offering a gift and requiring a basic acknowledgement of funds. It's completely legal and routine. DeAndre didn't blink. He glanced at the document resting against the briefcase, analyzing it in less than a second. It took him only 3 sentences to completely annihilate the man's career and expose the disgusting truth to the crowd. Under California Penal Code Section 518, attempting to obtain a signature on a legally binding instrument through explicit threats of malicious prosecution qualifies as extortion and fraud by coercion, DeAndre stated, his voice carrying with absolute icy precision. Presenting a comprehensive inheritance waiver to an 18-year-old without legal representation while he is under severe emotional distress, while intentionally misrepresenting its actual financial value, is a direct violation of Bar Association ethics and constitutes predatory financial exploitation. If you do not remove that fraudulent document from my nephew's personal space within the next 3 seconds, I will personally ensure your license to practice law is permanently revoked before you even make it back to your car. The crowd of parents listening nearby collectively gasped. The quiet murmurs instantly erupted into shocked whispers. The words coercion, fraud, and extortion floated through the bright morning air, heavy, undeniable, and utterly devastating. The greasy lawyer began visibly sweating. A thick bead of moisture rolled down his temple and soaked into his collar. He looked frantically from the incriminating document to DeAndre, then to Bradley. He knew they had been caught red-handed. He knew this was not a simple family disagreement. It was a coordinated and highly illegal attempt to steal an inheritance through intimidation. And he knew the towering corporate titan standing in front of him was not bluffing in the slightest. DeAndre deliberately stepped forward, closing the distance and trapping the man inside his imposing shadow. He reached into the pocket of his perfectly tailored jacket and pulled out a thick embossed business card. He pressed it flat against the trembling lawyer's chest. I'm DeAndre, Senior Managing Partner at Vanguard and Pierce Corporate Litigation, DeAndre announced, deliberately projecting his voice so every parent and faculty member nearby could hear the reality of the situation. I am also this young man's uncle and his retained legal counsel. You currently have exactly 2 options. You can pack up your illegal paperwork and run, or you can stay right where you are and explain to the local police why you are participating in a coordinated conspiracy to commit wire fraud and extortion against a minor. The transformation was instant and absolutely pathetic. The greasy lawyer did not look to Bradley for permission. He did not defend his arrogant client. Basic survival instinct completely overrode his desire for a paycheck. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own scuffed shoes. He snatched the waiver documents from the briefcase, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped them onto the grass. Stuffing the papers into his worn leather bag, he slammed the clasps shut with a loud, frantic snap. I was not aware of the full context of this situation, the lawyer stammered, taking another massive step away from Bradley as though my ex-husband had suddenly become radioactive. I was retained for a simple delivery. I am withdrawing my representation effective immediately. I strongly advise you to leave the premises, sir. The lawyer turned and practically ran through the crowd of stunned parents, desperate to escape the catastrophic legal disaster he had just walked into. He never looked back once as he disappeared past the graduation banners and toward the parking lot. Bradley stood completely frozen. The arrogant smile that had covered his face moments earlier had been wiped away entirely, replaced with a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. His primary weapon of intimidation had just abandoned him in the middle of a crowded high school courtyard, leaving him utterly defenseless. He stood there exposed, looking like a foolish, desperate man whose enormous lie had just been dragged into the harsh daylight. Monica stood beside him with her jaw hanging open in shock. The oversized designer sunglasses she had used to glare down at us had slipped slightly down her nose, revealing wide, terrified eyes. She looked around at the judgmental, disgusted faces of the surrounding parents and realized the public humiliation they had planned for us had catastrophically backfired. The entire narrative had shifted by force. We were no longer the pathetic victims they had tried to portray. We were protected, defended, and extremely dangerous. DeAndre slowly turned his attention back to Bradley. The look of deep disgust on DeAndre's face was enough to make a weaker man collapse to his knees. "You brought a discount strip mall lawyer to threaten my family," DeAndre said, his tone dripping with absolute lethal contempt. "You truly have no idea what kind of war you just started, do you, Bradley?" DeAndre buttoned his suit jacket with one deliberate motion. His gaze remained fixed on Bradley, who was now visibly sweating beneath the intense morning sun. The departure of the fraudulent lawyer had left a massive hole in Bradley's offensive strategy, but DeAndre was not about to let him retreat. He was going to dismantle my ex-husband piece by piece right there on the graduation lawn. "When Elise texted me from that diner, she asked me to investigate your father's estate," DeAndre began, his voice carrying with devastating calmness. "You see, Bradley, my firm has an entire division dedicated to probate and inheritance law. It took my associates exactly 45 minutes to access the public filings in probate court. I read the actual will. I reviewed the real financial statements." Bradley swallowed hard. His eyes darted nervously toward the parents leaning closer, captivated by the unfolding drama. "Your father was a very observant man," DeAndre continued, taking another slow step forward. "He knew exactly what kind of son he had raised. He knew you were arrogant, selfish, and completely lacking in basic human decency. But more importantly, he knew you were a catastrophic failure when it came to managing genuine wealth. That is why he did not leave the majority of his liquid assets to you." DeAndre turned slightly, making sure his voice carried directly to Monica, who was clutching her expensive handbag like a life preserver. "The grandfather you never bothered introducing this boy to," DeAndre said, respectfully gesturing toward Leo, "established an irrevocable trust. He bypassed you completely, Bradley. He designated his only biological grandson as the primary and sole beneficiary of a portfolio valued at exactly $15 million. A collective gasp swept through the graduation crowd. $15 million. The sheer magnitude of the number hung in the air, heavy, undeniable, devastating. Monica stumbled backward. Her designer heels caught in the grass. Her jaw dropped open as she stared at Bradley with an expression of absolute horrified realization. "$15 million? Monica whispered, her voice trembling. "You told me the estate was tied up in corporate debt. You told me he left us nothing." DeAndre let out a short, humorless laugh. "Look at him," Bradley sneered, his voice dripping with desperate elitism. "He's standing here in a public school graduation gown pretending he belongs in the same financial universe as people like me. He has no pedigree, no elite education, no powerful network. He was raised by a bitter woman eating greasy diner breakfasts in sweatpants." He laughed harshly and spread his arms toward the stunned crowd. "And now suddenly everyone expects me to hand over $15 million to a teenager who's statistically destined to waste it? Please." Leo had remained silent through the entire confrontation. Calm. Still. Watching. He slowly handed his graduation cap to one of his friends and stepped away from me. For the first time since Bradley had arrived, my son looked directly into his father's eyes without a trace of confusion. Only disappointment. "Are you finished?" Leo asked quietly. Bradley scoffed. "Oh, now the kid wants to talk." Leo ignored the insult completely. "You've spent the last 20 minutes talking about intelligence, success, wealth, and financial literacy," Leo continued calmly. "But you never once stopped to ask a very basic question." Bradley frowned. "And what question is that?" Leo tilted his head slightly. "What makes you think I need your money?" The courtyard fell silent again. Bradley blinked. "What?" Leo reached calmly into the inner pocket of his graduation gown and pulled out a slim navy blue envelope embossed with a silver crest. Several parents nearby immediately recognized the insignia. So did Bradley. His face visibly tightened. "No," Bradley whispered. Leo opened the envelope and removed a formal acceptance letter. "I was accepted into Stanford at 16, Leo said evenly. "Full academic scholarship." Another wave of shocked murmurs swept through the crowd. "I completed 2 internships before graduating high school," Leo continued. "One in quantitative systems analysis and another in cybersecurity infrastructure." Bradley's confident posture began collapsing inch by inch. Leo looked almost sympathetic as he continued. 3 months ago, I sold a machine learning optimization tool I built with 2 classmates." Bradley's breathing became shallow. Leo glanced briefly at DeAndre before returning his attention to his father. "The acquisition deal closed last Friday." He folded the letter neatly. "The payout allocated to me after taxes was $2.3 million. Monica gasped loudly. Bradley looked like all the oxygen had been ripped out of his lungs. "You," he croaked. Leo's expression never changed. "I already have financial advisors," he said calmly. "Real ones. Not ambulance-chasing fraud lawyers hiding inheritance waivers inside fake gift receipts." A few parents nearby actually laughed. Bradley's face burned crimson. "And unlike you," Leo added softly, "I actually read contracts before signing them." That hit harder than anything DeAndre had said. I saw it instantly. Because Bradley finally realized something horrifying. The boy he abandoned 18 years ago had inherited every ounce of intelligence Bradley once admired in himself, but none of the cruelty. Leo was everything Bradley pretended to be. And everyone standing in that courtyard could see it. Bradley looked around wildly at the staring parents, the faculty members whispering among themselves, the phones recording everything, Monica backing away from him in disgust, and DeAndre watching him like a man deciding whether something beneath his shoe was worth crushing. His empire was collapsing in real time. "You turned him against me," Bradley snapped suddenly, pointing at me with frantic desperation. "This is parental alienation. You poisoned him." "No," Leo interrupted sharply for the first time. The firmness in his voice cut through the courtyard like glass. "You did that yourself." Bradley froze. Leo took one final step forward. "You abandoned a pregnant 17-year-old because you thought she would ruin your future," he said. "Then you came back 18 years later to steal from your own son because you ruined your own future." Every word landed like a hammer. "You keep talking about success," Leo continued quietly. "But successful men don't threaten teenagers at graduation ceremonies. Successful men don't lie to their wives. Successful men don't try to scam their own children out of inheritance money because they gambled away their careers." Bradley opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Leo's voice lowered even further. "You're not powerful," he said. "You're desperate." Complete silence swallowed the courtyard. Then Monica suddenly ripped her engagement ring off her finger and threw it directly at Bradley's chest. "You disgusting liar," she hissed. The ring bounced off his expensive suit and disappeared into the grass. "I'm done." She turned and stormed away through the crowd without looking back. Bradley stood alone. Completely alone. No lawyer. No wife. No authority. No dignity. Just a sweating, ruined man standing in the middle of a high school graduation while dozens of strangers watched the collapse of the illusion he had spent his entire life building. DeAndre adjusted his cufflinks calmly. "If I were you," he said coolly, "I'd leave before campus security arrives with the police report my firm is currently filing." Bradley looked at me one last time. For the first time in 18 years, there was no arrogance left in his eyes. Only fear. He turned without another word and walked away through the crowd while parents openly moved aside like they didn't want to touch the shame surrounding him. I watched him disappear into the parking lot. And I felt absolutely nothing. Bradley kept pacing across the grass, gesturing wildly toward Leo. Do you people seriously believe a $15 million trust belongs in the hands of a public school teenager? He shouted, his voice cracking with rage and desperation. Do you think this boy has even the slightest concept of generational wealth? I went to Harvard, he continued, striking his chest. I sat in classrooms with the future leaders of the global economy. I learned how to multiply capital, leverage assets, and navigate international markets. I earned my place in finance through relentless ambition and elite pedigree. He stopped pacing and stepped closer to Leo, staring down at the simple navy graduation gown with open disgust. What exactly have you done to deserve a $15 million portfolio? Bradley demanded loudly, making sure every parent in the silent crowd heard his venom. You're standing here in a cheap polyester gown on an average public school football field. You haven't even taken a basic economics course. You probably spend your weekends playing video games and begging your mother for pocket money. He shook his head sharply. Giving a fortune to an untrained, unrefined boy is a crime against capitalism. You would destroy that money within months. You'd waste it on meaningless garbage because you have no discipline and no understanding of how the real world works. Behind him, Monica stood with her arms tightly crossed. Despite her earlier shock at Bradley's collapse, she now seemed eager to align herself with his cruelty if it meant saving her image in front of the wealthy crowd. She nodded along to his speech, staring at Leo with identical contempt. I tightened my grip on my handbag, ready to step in, but a soft hand touched my arm. Leo. My 18-year-old son gave me a subtle, reassuring nod. He didn't need protection. He had watched me dismantle hostile corporate executives his entire life and had inherited my absolute refusal to be intimidated. Leo stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the man who contributed nothing to his life except genetics. He stood tall, shoulders relaxed, expression completely calm. There was no anger in his eyes, only the clinical detachment of someone observing a flawed system breaking down in real time. You place a lot of value on elite education, Mr. Bradley, Leo said evenly. You seem to believe prestige is the same as competence. That makes sense for someone who relies entirely on a degree to validate their worth. Bradley scoffed loudly, throwing his head back. Don't try to sound intelligent, kid. It's pathetic. He pointed at Leo, turning to the crowd. This is what you're defending? A high school graduate with no college prospects? A dead end like his mother. Leo didn't react. Actually, Leo said, his voice dropping slightly, I declined my university offers. I won't be attending college this fall. Bradley burst into laughter. A loud, theatrical, mocking laugh. He clapped his hand against his thigh, wiping at an imaginary tear. A dropout, he wheezed. A high school graduate with no future just turned down college. And this is the genius you expect to inherit $15 million. He shook his head in disbelief. What are you going to do, kid? Flip burgers? Sweep floors? Leo waited patiently for the laughter to fade. Then he spoke again. I didn't choose college, he said calmly, because I've already started my own company. The silence that followed was immediate. Heavy. Absolute. For the first time, Bradley stopped laughing. He blinked, confused. Then he forced another laugh, louder, sharper, desperate. Oh, this is priceless, Bradley said, gesturing to the crowd. You started a company. What is it, kid? Lawn mowing? Phone repairs? Let me guess, you built a little basement startup and now you're calling yourself an entrepreneur. He stepped forward aggressively, the laughter gone now, replaced by hostility. You think playing business makes you a man? Bradley snapped. I deal with real executives. I crush basement startups like yours before I finish my morning coffee. He jabbed a finger toward Leo's chest. You're a delusional child pretending to be important. Bradley turned toward me, then DeAndre, his desperation finally fully exposed. "Do you think you've won today?" he shouted. "Do you think bringing a corporate lawyer to a high school graduation changes anything?" His voice rose higher, cracking under pressure. "I am the executor of my father's estate." She stopped directly beside our table, the glass of red wine trembling slightly in her hand. "Well, this is a surprise," Monica announced, her voice sharp and performative, cutting through the soft jazz that filled the restaurant. "I didn't expect to see you here." Her eyes flicked over me, then Leo, taking in the tailored clothing, the quiet confidence, the private corner of the obsidian cut reserved for people who didn't need to announce their importance. Her lips tightened. "Interesting," she added. "So this is where you've been hiding. Playing wealthy." Leo didn't react. He calmly set his fork down and leaned back slightly, studying her with the same detached curiosity he had once reserved for his father. I wiped my hands on my napkin and met Monica's gaze. "This isn't a game," I said evenly. "You should return to your table." Monica let out a short laugh and turned her body slightly, as if inviting the surrounding diners to witness her performance. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Don't pretend you belong in a place like this. We both know what you are. You're the woman who spent 18 years raising a child on scraps while my husband built real wealth." Her eyes sharpened. "And now suddenly you're sitting in members-only restaurants, wearing designer clothes, acting like you're something more than." "Then what?" Leo interrupted calmly. The question wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Monica blinked, thrown off for a fraction of a second. Leo continued, voice steady. "Then someone who made better decisions?" A few nearby diners turned their heads. Monica's grip tightened around her wine glass. "You don't understand anything about decisions," she snapped. "You were given everything. That trust, that money, that opportunity, it wasn't earned." Leo nodded slightly, as if considering her point. Then he spoke. "You're right," he said. "It wasn't earned." Monica looked momentarily satisfied. Leo's gaze lifted. "It was protected." Silence settled again. Even the ambient music seemed to fade under the weight of attention. Leo leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "You and my biological father spent weeks trying to manipulate, intimidate, and legally coerce a teenager into signing away his inheritance," he said. "You stood in a school courtyard and publicly insulted me because you assumed I had no value outside of what you thought I might inherit." His voice stayed calm, but every word landed precisely. "And now you're surprised I'm in a room like this?" Monica's jaw tightened. Leo tilted his head. "Tell me, Monica," he said quietly. "If I had signed that waiver, would you still be here, defending me as someone who deserves better?" The question hit harder than anything shouted. For the first time, her confidence flickered. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Leo straightened slightly. "That's what I thought." A soft movement came from across the room. Bradley had finally noticed. He was staring now. Not at Monica. At us. At the table. At the realization forming slowly behind his eyes that this wasn't coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was positioning. Monica followed his gaze and stiffened. "Wait," she said slowly. "You said this restaurant required a six-figure membership threshold," Leo finished for her. He glanced around the room casually. "Which is why you assumed we couldn't be here." A pause. Then, quietly, "We own it." The words didn't come with drama. No raised voice. No smile. Just fact. Monica froze. Across the room, Bradley stood up so quickly his chair scraped violently against the floor. Heads turned. He stared at us like he was seeing something fundamentally impossible. "No," he said, shaking his head once. That's not possible." Leo looked at him now. Calm. Direct. "It's already done," he said. The silence that followed was total. Even Monica didn't speak. Bradley took one step forward, then another, as if pulled by something he couldn't control. For the first time since the courthouse threats, since the courtyard humiliation, since the collapse of his carefully constructed identity, he looked unsure. Because finally, he understood something he had refused to accept from the beginning. He was never in control of the story. He had just been allowed to speak in it. She wanted a reaction she could take back to Bradley like proof of victory. What she got instead was stillness. I set my napkin down neatly beside my plate and finally spoke, my voice calm enough that it barely carried beyond our table. "You really shouldn't have done that." Monica let out a short laugh, tilting her head as if I'd just said something adorable. "Oh? And why's that?" "Because your cheap bag got a little red wine on it." That was when Leo leaned back slightly in his chair and tapped once on the edge of his phone screen under the table. A small, almost invisible gesture, but deliberate. Across the restaurant, two things happened almost at once. First, the maitre d' stiffened near the entrance, speaking quietly into his earpiece. Second, the faint, controlled hum of movement began near the perimeter of the dining room, subtle shifts in posture from staff who were no longer just staff. Monica didn't notice any of it. She was too busy smiling at me, waiting for me to break. I looked at her bag for a moment, then back at her. "That bag you just drenched wine on," I said gently, "isn't mine." Her smile flickered. I continued, still even. "It belongs to the restaurant's private client storage system. It's loaned out only when a guest is cleared for level 3 access." A pause. Leo added quietly, without looking up, "And you're not cleared for anything." For the first time, uncertainty cracked through Monica's expression. From behind her, a calm voice cut in. "Is there a problem here?" The restaurant manager had arrived, followed by two security personnel who weren't wearing the typical uniform. Their presence was too controlled, too alert. Monica immediately straightened, lifting her chin. "Yes," she said quickly. "This woman is being ridiculous. She's pretending her purse is." The manager didn't even look at the bag at first. His eyes were on a discreet tag sewn into its interior seam. Then his expression changed. Not anger. Recognition. He stepped closer, bending slightly, and spoke into his device again, short, precise words. Monica's confidence began to falter. "What is going on?" she snapped. "Do you know who I am?" "My husband is." "I know exactly who your husband is," the manager interrupted calmly. Then he looked at her. "And I know he does not have clearance to be in this section of the restaurant either." The silence that followed was different from before. This time, it wasn't theatrical. It was procedural. One of the security staff extended a hand politely but firmly. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to need you to step away from the table." Monica blinked. "Excuse me?" Leo finally looked up at her. Not amused. Not angry. Just finished. "You were wrong about the bag," he said quietly. "And you were wrong about everything else too." A beat. Then he added, almost softly, "You just picked the wrong table to perform at." The manager turned slightly toward me, his tone shifting. "Apologies for the interruption. Everything appears to be in order here." I gave a small nod. "Of course it is." Behind Monica, Bradley had finally stood up from his table. He had been watching for a while. And for the first time since this entire situation began, he wasn't speaking. He was staring. Not at me. At Leo. Because something in the way the room had just responded, too fast, too coordinated, too final, was starting to tell him what he hadn't been able to accept at the graduation field. This wasn't luck. And it wasn't coincidence. It was infrastructure. And he was only now realizing he'd been trying to intimidate people who already owned the room he was standing in. He stopped just short of our table, smoothing his tie as if the motion alone could restore control over the situation. For a brief second, he scanned the scene, Monica standing too close to me, the wine on the floor, the silence of the surrounding tables. Then his eyes landed on me. And Leo. The color drained from his face so fast it was almost physical. Not anger. Recognition. Followed immediately by panic. He glanced over his shoulder, checking on his investor under the chandelier. The man was still seated, still observing, but no longer with passive interest. Now there was attention. Evaluation. Bradley understood instantly what that meant. He turned back, forcing authority into his posture. "What is going on?" he demanded. Before I could respond, Monica stepped in, performing on cue. She pointed at my ruined bag with exaggerated disgust. "She came over here," she said loudly, "and deliberately caused this. She's been harassing us the entire time." Bradley immediately took the narrative and sharpened it. "You were warned, Elise," he said, raising his voice so the room would hear. "At the graduation, I told you this behavior would not be tolerated." He gestured toward me as if presenting evidence. "You are unstable. You are following us. You are disrupting a private business meeting in a high-end establishment." I didn't react. I simply took a slow sip of sparkling water. That calmness did what shouting never could. It made him louder by comparison. Bradley snapped his fingers sharply. "Manager," he barked. "Now." The entire room shifted. The manager approached calm, composed, observant. The kind of calm that didn't come from uncertainty, but from information. His eyes moved across the scene in sequence. Spilled wine, Monica's stance, Bradley's posture, then finally me. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Bradley didn't hesitate. "There is a serious issue," he said, pointing directly at me. "This woman is harassing my wife. I am a senior investment director. I have an extremely important client here. This is disrupting a critical business engagement." The room fell into absolute silence. Even the background music felt distant now. Every table nearby was watching. Bradley straightened slightly, feeding off the attention. "I want them removed immediately," he continued. "They do not belong in a place like this. They're interfering with elite-level business operations." The manager didn't answer right away. He looked at Bradley for a long moment. Not with confusion. With confirmation. Then he shifted his attention, not to Bradley's face, but past him. To me. And everything about his posture changed subtly. Not fear. Respect. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "do you wish for this to be handled publicly or privately?" That question landed heavier than anything Bradley had said so far. Because it confirmed what he hadn't understood yet. He wasn't the one being evaluated in this room. He was the one being assessed. He stepped back. Just one step. But it was enough to signal that his confidence had finally started to fracture in real time. The manager didn't move toward him. He didn't need to. The presence of security on either side of the room had already turned the situation into something formal, not emotional. "Sir Bradley," the manager said evenly, "I am asking you to leave the restaurant now." Monica froze. For the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked uncertain, like she had stepped into a version of reality where her usual tactics didn't work. Bradley tried again, forcing authority into his voice. "This isn't over." He pointed at me. "I will deal with you in court." "I will." Leo cut in softly, without raising his voice. "It already ended when you started lying in a room full of people who can verify reality." That sentence landed harder than anything shouted before it. Bradley opened his mouth, but nothing came out for a second. Not anger. Not rebuttal. Just silence. The manager raised a hand slightly. Security moved in closer, not aggressive, but final. "Sir," the manager said, "last request." Bradley looked around the room one last time. The investor under the chandelier wasn't watching his phone anymore. He was watching Bradley like a risk assessment that had already been rejected. And for the first time, Bradley understood something very simple. He wasn't being challenged. He was being removed. Not from the table. From relevance. Monica slowly stepped away from him, like she was recalculating which version of this situation she belonged to. Bradley exhaled sharply, adjusted his jacket, and tried to recover whatever dignity he could still pretend to own. But there wasn't any left to perform. And this time, when he finally turned toward the exit, nobody followed him with their attention. That was the part that broke him the most. The room fell into an even heavier silence. Bradley froze mid-sentence, still holding the tablet as if he had suddenly forgotten what it was for. Harrison didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I don't want your invented strategies, Bradley," he repeated, colder than before. "I want results. And all you've delivered lately is risk exposure and public embarrassment." Bradley swallowed hard. He tried to recover, to reframe it, to do what he always did, sound convincing. The restaurant incident was exaggerated by third parties. It was a personal situation that was misinterpreted. It has no real impact on. It absolutely has real impact, Harrison cut in without looking at his notes. Because funds don't invest in executives who become viral liabilities. They invest in stability, in control, in judgment. The word control lingered in the air like a verdict. Bradley clenched his jaw. His polished facade was cracking in real time. He looked around the table as if searching for support, but all he met were neutral, evaluative stares. People who had already made up their minds and were only waiting for the formal conclusion. "We're in a sensitive market phase," he tried again, lower now, faster. "If I'm allowed to execute the next investment cycle, I can reverse perception. I have access to key deals, I have." Harrison placed his pen down on the table. A small gesture, but absolute. "You don't have access to anything that isn't already questioning your credibility." He leaned in slightly. "And that includes your position here." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was final. Bradley stood still. For the first time in a long time, he had no prepared response. No excuse. No alternate narrative. Just reality unfiltered, with nowhere to redirect it. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, the dynamic was entirely different. At the Apex project, Leo reviewed metrics on a wide display, speaking calmly, without urgency, to people who didn't interrupt him or challenge him without reason. There was no need for drama there. The system was already working. And that was the difference Bradley had never understood. Power wasn't sustained by volume. It was sustained by structure. Bradley sent the package of fabricated claims into circulation with surgical timing. Within hours, anonymous blog posts began appearing across niche tech forums. Then came slightly more polished industry analysis articles. Then reposts. Then screenshots. Then speculation threads. The language was always careful enough to avoid legal consequences, but aggressive enough to seed doubt. Unverified stability concerns in Apex Beta. Possible structural flaw in compression architecture. Whispers of catastrophic data integrity risk. It didn't matter that none of it was true. In high-stakes markets, perception often moved faster than verification. By the next morning, Apex had shifted from revolutionary breakthrough to potential hidden liability in the eyes of people who were only half paying attention, but fully controlling capital. Inside Pinekel Ventures, Bradley refreshed his dashboard repeatedly, watching early sentiment indicators fluctuate. He leaned back in his chair, trying to feel relief. It worked, at least partially. But instead of satisfaction, a deeper anxiety started creeping in. The kind that comes when you realize you've lit a fire in a room you might still be standing in. Because Apex wasn't reacting like a normal startup. There were no panic statements. No defensive press releases. No erratic counterleaks. Silence. Clean, deliberate silence. At Obsidian Cut, that same silence had a different texture entirely. Leo sat across from me, reviewing live analytics on a secured tablet. The numbers were shifting, yes, but not collapsing. Not even close. If anything, engagement from institutional partners had increased overnight. Interesting, Leo said calmly, scrolling once. They're testing volatility response. Someone is trying to simulate reputational pressure. I didn't look up from my glass. Or manufacture it, I replied. He nodded slightly, as if confirming a hypothesis rather than reacting emotionally. What do we do? He asked. That was the part Bradley never understood about real power structures. You didn't always react immediately. Sometimes you observed who was trying to force movement. Then you let them reveal themselves completely. I finally glanced toward Leo. Nothing yet, I said. Let them believe it's working. And in a glass office high above the city, Bradley continued refreshing his screen, convinced he was controlling the narrative, without realizing he had just stepped into someone else's already prepared system of containment. The trap wasn't Apex. It was everyone trying to touch it. Bradley's confident expression didn't quite fade, but it tightened. That small shift, almost imperceptible, was what happened when a mind built on control started noticing gaps it couldn't immediately explain. Across the city, the effects of his campaign continued to ripple outward. On financial terminals, Apex's projected valuation graphs dipped sharply, then stabilized in a way that didn't match typical panic-driven sell-offs. On private investor channels, the story was no longer just possible vulnerability, but increasingly coordinated narrative manipulation. Analysts were starting to ask a different question. Who benefits from this information surfacing exactly now? That question was dangerous. Because once markets started asking motive instead of reacting to headlines, control began to slip. Back in Bradley's office, Monica was still smiling, pouring champagne like nothing in the world could reach them. She didn't understand markets, only momentum. And right now, she thought they were riding it. You should see the reactions online, she said, leaning over his shoulder. Everyone is terrified of this Apex thing. You basically exposed a fraud. Bradley nodded slowly, but his eyes were no longer fully on her. They were on his second monitor. A new alert had appeared. Not a news article. Not a blog post. A legal notification from Pinekel Ventures' Internal Compliance Division. His fingers hovered over the trackpad. He clicked. The document loaded. At first, it looked routine, corporate language, structured formatting, standard escalation headers. Then he saw the classification tag at the top. Market Manipulation Review, Active Investigation. The glass in his hand tilted slightly. He set it down more carefully than before. Monica finally noticed his silence. What is it? She asked, her tone losing a fraction of its confidence. Bradley didn't answer immediately. Because for the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to win. He was thinking about how fast this could turn around. And somewhere deep in the system he thought he controlled, the narrative he had built was already being quietly traced back, line by line, transaction by transaction, by people who understood exactly how his kind of strategy worked. He had aimed at Apex. But investigations don't always start where the attack begins. Sometimes they start where the money moves. Leo stood beside me in silence, watching the data panel shift without anyone needing to raise their voice. Bradley's message was still open on the screen. It didn't need to be read twice. Direct threats. Explicit intent. References to specific assets. Coercion tied to a trust fund. Language of financial retaliation. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It was evidence. And in a room like this, that distinction mattered more than anything. He sent it unencrypted, one of the analysts said from the back, eyes still on his monitor. Traceable number. Confirmed location. corporate network from Pinekel Ventures. Another added almost immediately. We have a timestamp synchronized with prior market activity. It matches the peak of Apex misinformation. No one in the room reacted with surprise. Only efficiency. I looked at the main display where Bradley's message now sat inside a live forensic capture system. Every word had been segmented, tagged, and converted into usable legal structure. Leo tilted his head slightly toward me. "He's trying to turn this into personal warfare," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "He's trying to turn it into control." He just left the full trail behind. A second monitor updated. Legal hold initiated, market manipulation plus intimidation trace active. The system wasn't just observing anymore. It was building the case. And that was what Bradley had never understood from the beginning. In his world, aggression was strategy. In ours, it was just another input. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gesture. I simply scanned the data. "Confirm full chain of custody," I said. "Yes, Ms. Elise," the room answered in unison. Leo looked back at the screen, where the message continued replicating across layers of legal and financial analysis. "He's going to deny it," he said. "It won't matter," I replied. "We're not in the phase where we believe anyone anymore." Across the city, Bradley still thought he had sent a threat. But in the glass tower, what he had actually sent was something very different. A recorded, verifiable, traceable admission connecting his sabotage campaign directly to an explicit act of intimidation. And the system, cold, precise, and already in motion, was no longer reacting with emotion. Only consequences. The screen was lit by the toxic, arrogant text message my ex-husband had just sent me. I read his desperate threats twice, then read his boast about a $50 million acquisition and his promise to strip a $15 million trust fund away. He had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to execute his professional downfall. I looked across the table at Leo. My son was seated in a high-backed leather chair, typing furiously on a holographic keyboard. He was monitoring the artificially plummeting valuation of his own company. Most 18-year-old founders would be hyperventilating in a paper bag, watching their life's work get dragged through the mud by anonymous journalists. But Leo was my son. He possessed a cold, analytical calm that made him terrifying in any boardroom. "They're coordinating the attack perfectly," Leo said, eyes scanning rapidly updating headlines. Anonymous leaks hit 3 major tech publications at once. Bots amplified the security failure narrative across social media within minutes. Fake investor panic emails are already circulating. The market is reacting exactly as expected. I placed my hand on his shoulder. "A textbook smear campaign," I said. "Fast, vicious, and untraceable to the untrained eye." But Bradley made a fatal mistake. He let ego override operational security. He literally documented his intent to profit from the exact market movement he's now influencing. The glass doors slid open and DeAndre entered the command center, carrying the weight of a senior corporate litigator. His sleeves were rolled up, tablet in hand, expression sharp with anticipation. "Tell me we have something solid," DeAndre said. "Because I just traced the financial trail behind those anonymous leaks. Whoever did this used proxies, but the actual transfer to the bloggers came from a personal account." Sloppy. I slid my phone across the table. Bradley's message was still glowing on the screen. "Read it," I said. DeAndre did. Then he exhaled slowly, almost laughing. "He really put this in writing," he said. "He explicitly ties a $50 million acquisition to a coordinated attempt to manipulate market perception and then threatens legal destruction against a private individual tied to it. That's spectacularly stupid." "He thinks he's untouchable," I said. "He thinks we're amateurs." DeAndre leaned back. "This is no longer a family dispute. This is securities fraud, market manipulation, breach of fiduciary duty. If we hand this to the SEC along with the transfer records, he's not just fired. He's looking at federal charges. A silence followed. Leo looked up. So we end him now? I shook my head. No. If we shut it down now, he disappears quietly. That's not enough. We let him believe he's won. DeAndre understood immediately. We go dark. Exactly, I said. We let the valuation collapse. We let him think Apex is broken. Then we invite him to close the deal. Leo's expression sharpened into something almost amused. We make him come to us, he said. Precisely. Across the city, Bradley was already celebrating. His office overlooked San Francisco. A bottle of champagne sat half empty on his desk. Monica lounged beside him, smiling like everything had already been secured. You look like a man who just conquered the world, she said. I did more than conquer it, Bradley replied. I broke it. The target company was collapsing exactly as planned. Headlines confirmed the narrative. Investors were fleeing. The valuation was free-falling. Then his secure inbox chimed. Bradley froze. A new message. He opened it and read. The startup was surrendering. The anonymous founder admitted financial collapse. They were offering a full acquisition at a fraction of value. They were requesting an in-person closing meeting at Pinecell Ventures by the end of the week. Bradley stood up so fast his chair hit the floor. Yes, he whispered. Then louder, yes. He had done it. He had crushed a unicorn and forced a surrender. He called Monica immediately. We won, he said, pacing. They're finished. They're coming in to sign. Monica laughed in delight, already talking about luxury cars and Monaco. Bradley ended the call, poured champagne, and stared out at the city skyline like a man who believed he had mastered it. He imagined the boardroom, the signing, the $50 million commission, the validation. And then, darker, he thought of me, sitting somewhere in fear and humiliation. He smiled, completely unaware he had just walked into a carefully prepared trap. Because the founders arriving on Friday weren't victims. They were executioners. Bradley didn't move at first. It wasn't denial anymore. It was something heavier, like his body had stopped responding to his instructions while his mind kept trying to force the illusion back into place. His eyes stayed locked on Elise, but they no longer carried confidence. They carried calculation, rapid, collapsing calculation, like a system running too many processes at once and overheating. This doesn't make sense, he said again, but this time it sounded less like an accusation and more like a failing equation. You're not the founder. The founder is anonymous. That was the entire structure, legal separation, layered shell entities, protected IP chain. Elise gently closed the folder in front of her. The sound was soft. Final. Not theatrical. Not aggressive. Worse than that. Certain. You're correct, she said. The founder was anonymous. She paused just long enough for the room to feel the weight of the sentence. Then added, until it wasn't necessary anymore. The silence that followed was not the kind Bradley was used to commanding in rooms like this. This wasn't the silence of intimidation or anticipation. This was the silence of systems resolving. Like a final lock clicking into place. Monica shifted in her chair, suddenly less confident, her earlier arrogance dissolving into something closer to confusion. This is insane, she muttered. Bradley, tell them this is insane. We were promised, you said this was a guaranteed acquisition. Bradley didn't answer her. He couldn't. Because his attention was now trapped on the holographic projection hovering above the marble table. Leo had activated it fully. The Apex system wasn't just displaying numbers anymore, it was displaying history dash, live infrastructure logs, ownership authentication chains, encrypted timestamp development records stretching back years. And at the very top of it all, A single authority signature node. Unchanged. Unbroken. Active. Bradley leaned forward slightly without realizing it, like a man being drawn towards something he didn't want to understand. No, he whispered again, but weaker now. That signature, that can't be. Leo finally looked at him directly. For the first time that morning, there was something in Leo's expression that wasn't calm neutrality. It was mild disappointment. Like watching someone misread a very simple system for the 100th time. It's real-time governance control, Leo said. Fully distributed authorization. Zero external override points. Bradley's throat tightened. That's not what I mean, he snapped, voice rising again as panic tried to reassemble his ego. That identity node, that's tied to executive access. That means the founder would have to be. He stopped. Because his brain finally connected the missing shape. Not logically. Emotionally. And the moment it formed, it felt wrong. Impossible. His eyes flicked from Leo to Elise. Then back to the projection. Then again. No, he said quietly, almost breathless now. No, no, no. Monica stood up abruptly. What is going on? She demanded, her voice cracking under the pressure now. Bradley, why are they acting like this is already decided? Elise didn't even look at her. Her focus stayed on Bradley. Not with anger. Not with triumph. With something far more unsettling. Professional finality. You built your entire strategy on a false assumption, Elise said calmly. You assumed Apex was collapsing because of external pressure. Bradley swallowed hard. Elise continued. But the market reaction you saw wasn't collapse. A pause. It was segmentation. Leo tapped the holographic interface once. The data shifted. The valuation drop that Bradley had celebrated flattened. Reorganized. Reframed. It wasn't a collapse at all. It was controlled redistribution. A deliberate narrowing of exposure. A filtration process. Bradley's breath caught. His mind started to accelerate again, trying to rebuild reality around this new information. That's not possible, he said again, but now it sounded desperate. You can't isolate market exposure like that at scale without triggering regulatory. You can, Elise said, if you're not reacting to the market. She leaned slightly forward. If you're the market. The words hit differently. Not as a threat. As a statement of architecture. Monica took a step back from the table. Bradley, she said quietly now, uncertainty replacing everything she had been wearing like jewelry. What did you do? That question landed harder than anything else in the room. Because it implied something Bradley had been avoiding since the moment he opened the first anonymous leak campaign. Responsibility. He straightened quickly, forcing himself back into posture, into identity, into something he could control. I executed a standard acquisition pressure strategy, he said sharply. It's hostile market conditioning. It's used every day in VC. There's nothing illegal about. DeAndre laughed once. Not loudly. Just enough to cut through the room. That's not what the SEC will call it, he said quietly. Bradley turned his head. For the first time, he noticed DeAndre wasn't just present. He was prepared. Tablet open. Documentation stacked. Chains of evidence already compiled. Bradley's confidence cracked again. What is this? He demanded. What is actually happening here? Elise stood slowly. And when she did, the entire room shifted without anyone acknowledging it. Not physically. Structurally. Like gravity adjusting itself. You wanted a valuation collapse, she said. Bradley didn't respond. You created artificial fear in the market, she continued. You triggered coordinated misinformation channels. You financed anonymous dissemination. You tied it directly to your own acquisition timeline. Her gaze stayed steady. And then, she added, you documented intent. A pause. That's not strategy, Bradley. Another step closer. That's exposure. The room felt smaller now. Not because it physically changed, but because Bradley's options were shrinking in real time. Harrison finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but absolute. "Bradley," he said, "step away from the table." It wasn't anger. It was containment. Bradley didn't move immediately. Because for the first time in his life, stepping away didn't feel like retreat. It felt like acknowledgement. Monica was staring at him now like she was trying to decide whether he was still the same person she married, or something she had misunderstood entirely. Bradley finally exhaled. Slow, unsteady, and took one step back, then another. And in that moment, quiet, irreversible, and completely uncelebrated, he realized the truth. He had never been steering the deal. He had been inside it, and it had already closed around him. The silence that followed his outburst wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of a tense boardroom. It was heavier than that, something closer to the moment a room realizes, all at once, that one person has just made an irreversible mistake in public. Bradley was still breathing hard, still clinging to his narrative as if it could hold reality together by force. His hand remained extended, pointing at me, as though accusation alone could reshape the situation into something he could control. Beside him, Monica stayed rigid, but the confidence in her expression had begun to fracture. It was subtle, just a slight hesitation in her eyes, but it was there now. For the first time, she was reading the room, and the room was not responding the way she expected. The board members, however, didn't move. They didn't intervene. They didn't call security. They didn't even ask for clarification. They simply watched. And that absence of reaction was itself a reaction. Harrison was the first to break the silence. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He only tilted his head slightly, as if examining a poorly constructed argument. "Bradley," he said calmly. "Stop." The way he said his name wasn't aggressive. It was corrective. Bradley blinked, thrown off by the lack of immediate support. "Sir, this is an intrusion." This woman, Harrison interrupted evenly, "is not an intrusion." He let the words settle. No urgency, no emotion, just certainty. Bradley's fingers loosened slightly around the contract without him noticing. I stepped forward, not toward him, just toward the table. The sound of my heels on the marble cut through the room cleanly, shifting attention without effort. Leo didn't look at Bradley. He hadn't since we entered. His gaze was fixed on the room itself, the executives, the environment, like someone analyzing a system he already understood. DeAndre opened his briefcase with a soft click. The sound was minimal, but in the silence it felt amplified. He placed a folder on the black marble with precise control. "Before we proceed with any discussion of acquisition," DeAndre said, "there is a preliminary matter the board must review." Bradley let out a short, uneasy laugh. "A preliminary matter? Seriously? We're in the middle of a $50 million transaction. Nothing is more important then." DeAndre opened the folder, and the atmosphere in the room shifted again. The first pages weren't explanations. They were evidence, records, financial transfers, screenshots, metadata, message logs. Bradley's phone vibrated on the table. Once, then again. One of the board members lowered his gaze to his own device. Then another followed. The pattern was immediate. Harrison didn't touch the folder. He didn't need to. He looked at Bradley as if he was observing something already fully resolved. "You've been very efficient," Harrison said finally. Bradley forced a smile. "Thank you. I knew the market would stabilize once I corrected the misinformation. This deal is going to secure the firm's position." "No," Harrison said. This time it wasn't gentle. It was final. Bradley froze. Harrison turned slightly toward one of the board members. "Confirm." The man scanned his screen for a few seconds, then looked up. "It's all here," he said. Personal transfers linked to coordinated disinformation. Third-party engagement. Market manipulation designed to trigger artificial valuation collapse. The words didn't land loudly. They landed cleanly, like a verdict. Bradley shook his head quickly. "No, that's taken out of context. That's an aggressive communication strategy, not." Harrison raised a hand. Bradley stopped mid-sentence. Not because he chose to. Because the room had already decided he no longer had space to continue. Harrison looked at me directly for the first time with full attention, as if the rest of the room had only been staging. "Ms. Elise," he said with controlled respect, "I understand this is your asset." It wasn't a question. It was confirmation. Bradley slowly turned his head toward me. For the first time since entering the room, his expression wasn't arrogance. It was confusion. "Your asset," he repeated. Monica stepped back without realizing it. I looked at him directly. No rush. No visible emotion. "You weren't closing an acquisition," I said. "You were trying to buy something that was already controlled." The silence deepened. Bradley opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His mind was trying to rebuild the situation into something familiar, something survivable, something he could still dominate. Harrison closed the folder calmly. "Bradley," he said, "you're leaving this room now. No anger. No drama. Just termination." Bradley took a step back instinctively. For the first time, he looked around the room as if it no longer belonged to him. As if it never had. Monica whispered his name, but it didn't carry the same certainty anymore. I stepped closer, not to him, but just close enough to make one thing unmistakably clear. This had never been about an acquisition. And now, at last, he was beginning to understand that. Harrison's words didn't echo in the room. They settled heavy, final, like concrete poured over something still trying to move underneath. Bradley stood frozen in the exact same position, one hand still gripping the edge of the marble table as if letting go would make him fall through the floor. His mouth was slightly open, but no sound came out anymore. The transformation wasn't gradual, it was total collapse. The arrogance, the certainty, the practiced dominance he had worn like armor all morning, it was gone. Stripped away in seconds, leaving only raw exposure. Monica had stopped moving entirely. Her eyes kept flicking between Leo and me, then back to Harrison, as if repetition might somehow change the meaning of what she had just heard. The designer handbag on the floor remained open, its contents scattered across the polished wood, but she didn't bend down. She didn't even seem to register it anymore. The room had become too large for small human gestures. Leo remained still beside me. Not reacting. Not performing. Just observing, calm, composed, like someone watching a system resolve exactly as expected. There was no shock on his face. Only confirmation. Harrison stepped slightly to the side, gesturing not with force, but with precision, like a man aligning final pieces on a board already decided. "Bradley," he said, "your misunderstanding is no longer a private matter." That phrase hit harder than anything before it. Because it wasn't anger. It wasn't insult. It was classification. Bradley swallowed visibly. The sound was dry, forced. This is not possible," he managed, voice cracking under the weight of his own disbelief. She didn't have voting control. She couldn't have acquired. There would have been disclosures, filings I would have seen. "You didn't see them," Harrison replied evenly, "because you weren't meant to." A quiet shift ran through the board members seated along the table. One of them finally looked away from his screen, as if the situation had just moved from financial to structural. Harrison turned slightly toward me again, this time with something closer to acknowledgement than explanation. Your position was executed through 3 offshore layers and 2 silent holding structures, he said. Legally compliant. Completely insulated. And finalized before Bradley's last performance review. Bradley's knees finally gave out in a subtle, humiliating adjustment. He caught himself quickly, forcing his posture upright again, but the damage was already visible. His body had registered the truth before his mind could fully accept it. Monica let out a small, uneven breath, half laugh, half denial. No, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. No, that's not. She doesn't run anything. She's just. Her voice faded when she saw Leo look at her. Not with anger. With recognition. Like she was something he had already finished categorizing long ago. Harrison continued, voice steady. The 30% stake is not symbolic, he said. It is controlling interest in all strategic decisions affecting Pinekel Ventures' acquisition pipeline, including any motion involving Apex. The word, Apex, landed differently now. It no longer sounded like an opportunity. It sounded like a trap name that had already been activated. Bradley finally turned his head toward me again, slowly, like every degree of movement cost him something physical. His voice, when it came, was barely functional. He started. Then stopped. Restarted. You let me walk into this. There was no accusation in it anymore. Only realization. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You walked in on your own, I said calmly. You just never checked who built the room. That sentence seemed to land differently in him than everything else. Something in his expression shifted, not anger, not denial, but the first crack of comprehension that the entire framework he had been operating inside for weeks was never real to begin with. Leo finally spoke, quietly. You optimized for leverage, he said, almost conversationally. But you never verified ownership. Bradley looked at him, stunned, not because he didn't understand the words, but because he did. And that was worse. The room stayed silent again, but now it wasn't anticipation. It was resolution. Harrison straightened slightly, his tone returning to boardroom formality, but with a new edge underneath it. This meeting, he said, is no longer about acquisition. He paused just long enough for the full implication to settle. It is about control. And for the first time since Bradley had walked into that room believing he was the apex predator, he stopped looking like someone conducting a deal and started looking like someone who had already lost it. Monica stepped back another pace, as if Bradley's collapse might physically contaminate her if she stood too close. Her breathing turned shallow and uneven, her composure unraveling in real time. The same woman who had been laughing in triumph minutes earlier now avoided looking at the center of the room entirely, as though eye contact alone could drag her into the same destruction. Bradley remained on his knees. He didn't try to stand anymore. His body no longer responded with the same authority his ego had relied on for years. His hands trembled against the polished marble floor of the boardroom, too expensive, too silent, too unforgiving to hold a collapse like his without amplifying it. Harrison didn't move toward him. He didn't raise his voice. There was no satisfaction in his expression. Only a calm, administrative precision, almost surgical. You've already lost, Harrison said coldly. You just haven't understood the sequence yet. The general counsel was already speaking quietly into a phone, issuing precise instructions. There was no discussion, no hesitation, only execution of protocol. One of the board members closed the red folder carefully, as if the contents themselves carried risk. Another avoided looking at Bradley entirely, focusing instead on his screen with sudden urgency. The atmosphere had completely shifted. This was no longer an acquisition meeting. It was a containment event. Leo stood at the center of it all, still again, watching his biological father with an expression that wasn't anger or satisfaction. It was closure. System shut down. Bradley slowly lifted his head, searching for anything that might still hold. His gaze moved from me to Leo to Harrison, trying to locate a fracture in the structure that could still be exploited, still reversed, still negotiated. But there were no fractures. Only decision. "This can't be real," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. I closed the deal. I was going to. I was going to save this firm. Harrison cut him off without raising his voice. "You weren't going to save anything," he said. "You were going to compromise everything." Two executive security guards had already appeared at the threshold. They didn't enter immediately. They waited for confirmation. This was not a room that was breached without authorization, even now. Harrison gave a single nod, and then they entered. Bradley saw them and reacted instinctively, desperately trying to rise too quickly, losing balance, collapsing again in an undignified scramble. His pride was still trying to function even as his body refused to cooperate. "You don't have the right," he said hoarsely, scanning the room as if someone might intervene. "I'm a senior investment director." "I am." "You were," Harrison corrected. The word landed cleanly. Monica let out a strangled sound. She clutched her own arm tightly, as if anchoring herself to reality. She no longer looked at Bradley like a husband, only like something collapsing too violently to process. The guards approached without unnecessary force, but without hesitation. One placed a firm, professional hand on Bradley's shoulder. That was when panic finally broke him completely. "No, wait. This is a misunderstanding. I can fix this. I can recover the value." His voice no longer carried authority. It was noise. Fragmented resistance trying to assemble itself too late. Leo stepped forward for the first time since the confrontation began. Not toward Bradley. Just past him. And as he did, he stopped for a brief moment beside him. Bradley looked up at his son with a mixture of shock, desperation, and delayed recognition that had finally caught up with reality. Leo looked down at him without emotion. "Everything you did," he said quietly, "you documented yourself." Not an insult. A conclusion. Then he walked on. Bradley tried to speak again, but the sound never formed fully. The guards were already lifting him from the floor, escorting him out of the boardroom like a system failure being removed from a critical environment. His eyes found mine one last time. There was no arrogance left there. Only late understanding. Too late. When the glass doors closed behind him, the sound wasn't loud. But it was final. And in the silence that followed, only one thing remained: the system that had been operating exactly as designed from the beginning. The elevator doors sealed shut with a soft, final hiss, and for a brief moment there was nothing but the smooth hum of descent and the faint reflection of three figures standing in perfect silence. Above us, the 42nd floor of Pinecell Ventures was already becoming a memory. Below us, the city stretched outward like a living circuit board, endless glass, steel, and motion, completely unaware that one of its most ruthless predators had just been neutralized inside its own cage. Leo was the first to break the silence. "They'll move fast now," he said quietly, eyes still forward. Not nervous. Not excited. Just observant. Harrison won't wait for public exposure. He'll file everything before Bradley even understands what happened. Andre adjusted his cufflinks, his expression calm in the way only someone who had spent years dismantling legal empires could be calm. "He won't just file," Andre replied. "He'll overcompensate. Pinecell Ventures will want distance. Bradley will be the sacrifice they throw to regulators to preserve investor confidence." I watched the numbers on the elevator panel drop floor by floor. Each one felt like a closing chapter. "And Monica?" Leo asked. That question lingered for half a second longer than the rest. "She already made her decision upstairs," I said. "People like her don't mourn a collapse. They repositioned themselves around it. The elevator chimed softly as we reached the lobby. The doors opened, and the contrast was almost absurd. Upstairs, collapse of a career, dismantling of a reputation, a lifetime of arrogance reduced to legal documentation. Down here, sunlight, tourists, employees walking with coffee cups, phones ringing, life continuing exactly as it always had. No one looked at us differently. That was the strange thing about power, it rarely announced itself in the way people expected. It didn't need to. We stepped out together. Outside the building, the wind off the bay was sharp, clean, almost indifferent. I paused for a moment on the steps, letting the noise of the city settle around me. Leo stood beside me, slipping his hands into his pockets like any other young man leaving an office. Except he wasn't. Not anymore. "What happens next?" he asked. It wasn't uncertainty. It was curiosity about structure, about sequence. I looked out across the skyline. "Next," I said, "the system does what it always does when something unstable is removed. It stabilizes." Andre checked his phone once, then nodded slightly. "It's already starting," he said. "Trading desks are reacting to the leak exposure. Compliance teams are isolating Bradley's transactions. Internal audit notifications are triggering across 3 funds." I exhaled slowly. Bradley had spent his entire life believing power was something you took loudly, through intimidation, volume, spectacle. But real power rarely moved like that. It moved quietly, in signatures, filings, timestamps, and delayed consequences that felt sudden only to the person who had refused to see them coming. Inside the tower, Bradley was still on the floor. He had not yet been arrested. That part came later. First came the realization, then the paperwork, then the isolation, then the irreversible certainty that every system he thought he controlled had already turned away from him. By the time security finally escorted him out of the building, he wasn't shouting anymore. That phase had passed. What remained was something far worse: silence. The kind of silence that follows when every argument you thought you could make has already been legally answered in advance. Monica had already disappeared into a waiting car she ordered herself, her loyalty evaporating with surgical efficiency the moment the illusion of wealth stopped being profitable. No goodbye. No hesitation. Just recalibration. Bradley stood at the curb for several seconds before the realization fully settled that no one was coming back for him. Not his firm. Not his wife. Not the version of himself he had spent years pretending was real. Days later, the market would refer to it as a clean internal resolution. Regulators would call it cooperation with active investigation. Pinecell Ventures would release a carefully worded statement emphasizing isolated misconduct. But inside the industry, the story would be understood differently. A director had overplayed his hand. He had mistaken leverage for immunity. He had attacked a system without realizing he was already inside it. And in doing so, he had exposed himself to something far more precise than retaliation: correction. In the weeks that followed, Leo's name began circulating in places it had never been before, quietly, respectfully, in the way true talent is discussed before it becomes public legend. Not because of spectacle, but because of outcome. He didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He simply returned to work, refining what he had already built, improving what had already functioned beyond expectation. Andre resumed his cases. I returned to mine. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world rebalanced itself again. One evening, long after everything had settled, Leo asked me a question I didn't expect. "Was it always going to end like that?" he said. I thought about it for a moment. "No," I answered honestly. "Not like that. Not exactly." I looked at him then. "But people like your father, they always write their own ending. We just make sure they read it correctly." He nodded once, absorbing that in the quiet way he always did. Outside, the city lights flickered on, endless, structured, alive. And somewhere far behind us, in records, filings, and frozen accounts, a man who once believed he owned everything was learning the final lesson of his life. Power isn't what you claim. It's what remains when your certainty finally runs out.